Well, hello, my friends. Today we're starting on a new book, the book of Hebrews. Can I tell you, I always really look forward to reading this book. Now, the book of Hebrews is named for those for whom it was written. That is, for Hebrew or Jewish Christians. Now, these particular Jewish Christians were being torn apart by the growing divide between an increasingly Gentile church and their Jewish heritage. In earlier years, Jewish followers of Jesus were still considered Jews, and they were allowed to worship at the Jerusalem temple. But now things have changed. They were being shut out of Jewish society and were frequently persecuted by the Jews. Meanwhile, the church was becoming more and more Gentile. And so these Jewish Christians were feeling alienated. And they were in danger of retreating back into Judaism, or maybe becoming a faction with a hybrid mixture of Judaism and Christianity. In fact, as we shall read later in this letter, they were in danger of falling away from Christ altogether. Now, this letter was written both to show them the continuity of Christianity to our Old Testament roots, and also to show that Jesus was the final fulfillment of all that Moses and the prophets had written, as well as everything related to the temple and its sacrifices and ceremonies. He was superior to all that had come before him. Now, unlike most other New Testament letters, the author does not identify himself, but scholars are generally agreed that it was either Paul or one of his associates that wrote it. Barnabas, Apollos, Luke, and Silas have all been suggested as possible authors. But from the letter, it's clear that although we can't be sure of who wrote it, the author was well known to the recipients. The first two verses in this book lay out the author's main theme. It demonstrates both the continuity between the Old Testament era and the New Testament era, but also shows us how they are different. Let's read verse 1 through 2. God, after he spoke long ago to the fathers in the prophets in many portions and in many ways, in these last days has spoken to us in his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also made the world. In other words, it's the same God speaking in the Old Testament era and the New Testament era, but he is doing it in different ways. In the Old Testament, he was limited to speaking through prophets, and he did that through verbal prophecies, through prophetic acts, and through the Old Testament temple and its sacrificial systems, which were given to the great prophet Moses. But now, God has given us a higher form of communication through his Son. And remember that Christ continues to speak through the church, which is Christ's body. Now, this continuity between the old and the new is further shown, as we read, by the fact that the Creator we met in Genesis is also the Redeemer we meet in the New Testament. God's Son, Jesus Christ, is both the agent through whom God created the universe and also its heir. In other words, the whole universe is God's love gift to his Son, and also to us, for we are forever joined to his Son, Jesus. Now, in the following verses, we'll be shown that the new is far superior to the old. Jesus is far more than a prophet. He is the exact representation of God. He makes the invisible attributes of God visible. And unlike the prophets, who were but men, Jesus is the very radiance of God's glory, and he shares God's power to uphold all things. Let me read verse 3. And he is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature, and he upholds all things by the word of his power. And when he'd made purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So Jesus fulfills the work of the Old Testament priests and sacrifices in that he finally and forever has atoned for our sins. Now, beginning in the very next verse and continuing into the following chapters, the writer will demonstrate that Christ is superior to angels, to Moses, to the Jewish priesthood, the Mosaic law, to the temple and the sacrificial systems. And he begins in verse 4 by showing Christ is superior to angels. It says of Christ, having become as much better than the angels as he has inherited a more excellent name than they. Now, the word angel in the Greek literally translates as messenger. And these heavenly messengers sometimes brought God's communication to people, and at other times they acted to bring God's deliverance and help. But now God has given us a far superior messenger, helper, and agent, Jesus Christ. Now in the next 10 verses of this chapter, we'll read 7 quotations from the Old Testament. They demonstrate Christ's superiority to angels in that Christ alone is addressed as God's Son, and that he alone is to be worshiped, while angels, though they may appear glorious, are merely servants. We also read that Jesus alone has been seated on a throne and given the scepter to rule God's kingdom. And then finally in these verses, we're told that Jesus, in union with his Father, created the heavens and the earth, and that he alone is seated at the right hand of God the Father. And the chapter ends with verse 14. And speaking of angels, it says, "And are they not all ministering spirits, sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation?" You see, angels are merely our fellow servants, although we must honor them since they stand in the presence of God and are sent from him. But we should be careful of the current fascination among some with angels, lest we become distracted from Christ. In fact, in the New Testament, in various places, it warns us of being deceived by fallen angels. Now, we are to be grateful for all the servants of God that he uses, including angels. But we must not let any of them distract us from being wholly focused on Jesus as our all-sufficient guide and teacher. Like these Jewish believers, we too can become distracted from Christ by becoming overly focused on Jesus, on Jewish feast days and ceremonies, on angels and human leaders, or end-time speculation, or even particular spiritual manifestations. While all of these may have their proper place and can edify us, we must be careful of spiritual fads that race through the church and take people's attention off Jesus. In 2 Corinthians 11, verse 3, Paul writes, "But I am afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your minds will be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ." As this book teaches us so well, we must be radically focused on Jesus Christ, who is superior to all. God bless you. Hope you have a very, very blessed day.